Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tina, and thank you for the cast to have us presenting this. This is a very interesting topic that we're going to be presented today. I'm very curious of what our presenters are going to be developing. Liz Orembo is a research associate at Research ICT Africa, an African think tank based in Cape Town, South Africa, where she's working on projects around information disorders, platforms, and data governance. And Scott Timcke is a senior research associate at the same institute, where he leads the information disorders and AI risks and cybersecurity projects. His primary area of expertise is in democratic development policy, industrialization, and the role of the state in promoting egalitarian outcomes. His second book, Algorithms and the End of Politics, was published in 2021, and his third book, The Political Economy of Fortune and Misfortune, was just published 2 weeks ago. That's really something to congratulate you on, Scott. And I think that's super interesting. I'm going to be putting the link to that book on the chat, because I think, yes, this is what we do, academic life. And I think these kind of things are what gives it a vitality. So I'm just going to share the link to your book so people can see what you're up to these days. And so I think we can leave you the presentation. You can present the topic. And I was saying the topic of slow violence was very dear to us as a group, because we're dealing with this notion and what it means, how can we tackle it? And this is a very specific approach. One of the fellows, if I don't remember wrong, Tamara, was actually using this same notion in a different aspect. So I think your research will really have resonances in different levels. So at the end of your presentation, I'm probably going to ask you one question or two, maybe, and then open the floor to discussion so that we can really engage in a conversation with you guys. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Javier. That's a very lovely introduction for both of us, for all of us, for Liz and myself. We're very pleased to be here today to speak with you. We are from Research ICT Africa, which is a Cape Town-based think tank that is trying to do research for policy influence. Policy influence, of course, looks very different and has very different types of mechanisms from that which is probably sort of seen in the European context. However, we do sort of take some sort of inspiration from sort of European regulations, European situations, although adapting, reforming, and sometimes even resisting when appropriate and alike. Today, what we're going to be talking about is the slow violence of AI. And this comes off of a piece of written work that Liz, myself, and a couple other colleagues of ours published in Tech Policy Press a couple weeks ago. So, when time is fine, I'll drop the link there too, and people can go read the more nuanced take at their leisure. We have a slideshow, so I'm going to bring that up, and then we can launch into the chat. We're more than happy to have a good discussion afterwards. And, being sort of policy researchers who are a little bit less at the cutting edge of sort of epistemological, philosophical questions, we're more than happy to, take, instruction or learn from people who've been thinking about questions of violence, from your perspective. So we're very much looking forward to the conversational components. Anyway, let me put the slideshow up and we can then jump in. Just as a quick bit of housekeeping, Liz and I are both going to be presenting the piece. So we'll do a bit of a handover halfway through the talk, and then we'll bring it back for a bit of a discussion at the end. So I'll start off, and then Liz will take over. Okay. So one of the things that we're trying to do in situating this piece is to think about AI ethics. And so this is the larger type of conversation we wish to have. For us, sort of being in the South, being in the majority world, AI ethics looks slightly different. The types of considerations that we have resemble but express themselves slightly differently and even have a slightly different material basis to them. For example, and again, not to be excessively reductionist, but just to move the conversation forward, in Europe, questions about AI are really around questions of trust. We have citizen-state relations over here. The state is administratively capable. There are sort of flaws in the system, but these get remedied, these get addressed. There are processes, there are mechanisms in place. There are questions about identity, and there's the attempt to try hold corporations accountable, something that we don't really sort of see in the United States, for example. And this is one of the things that has put the European AI regulations, they're generally seen as well regarded. They're very highly regarded in that realm. At the same time, though, there are limits of applicability when it comes to sort of African situations. And I do want to really use the word plural over here because, big continent, many people, more than 1 billion, many countries, all with their own unique regulatory histories, colonial histories that create an operating environment where it's not easy to sort of insist upon one way of thinking about data and the like. At the same time, there is this moment with the formation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and the push towards the digital single market, where there needs to be some sort of regulatory harmony across all of these markets, across these territorialities, across these jurisdictions. And of course, it has a degree of difficulty and there are going to be harms and benefits caused by this type of harmonization. At the same time, though, there are types of considerations that Africans have to address that may not be quite as apparent when it came to sort of market formation in the European Union in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on and so forth. All that's to say is that the type of AI ethics that we're trying to think about is different. It necessarily is so. One of the things that we are trying to think about is questions of ownership. And this is also about global hierarchies, the traditional bifurcation or hierarchies between the global north and the global south, questions about foreignness, about companies that come in that don't really want to adhere to local regulatory statutes or have the type of power to create or take advantage of existing rent-seeking structures to try abscond or move around regulatory attempts. We also have a lot of attempts to regulatorily co-opt the process. For example, we see big platform companies like Facebook very much trying to use African faces to promote the interests of shareholders that are based mostly in the global north. So this is to say that, and one last other thing is that we also sort of see within the chain of AI, from all the way from the software also to the hardware components, there is again this realization Africa has this very rich vein of critical materials that are useful or necessary components to build the type of data centers, the types of hardware components, the supercomputer, the cloud computing apparatuses that will power the AI sector. And then on top of that, we have, so on top of the extractivism of critical materials and the type of artisanal mining and the type of poor labor practices that come with that, and the types of horrors that are associated with it, and again, also the types of conflicts that are stoked because of it, particularly in the Congo, we also sort of see a booming African consumer market. We well know that there's the adage that the vast majority, more than 50% of Africans are under the age of 25. This is now a rich market, not only to sell goods to, but also people that could become good data subjects. So all the way from sort of the very grounded material to the much more abstract notions of data subjects, we sort of see Africa's place in all of these situations. And again, none of these things are necessarily new, but there are new types of expressions. And in some cases, particularly when it comes to the hierarchy between the North and the South, they do take on different types of attributes. One thing that we are trying to do when thinking about this entire complex is to use three main concepts. One is slow violence, the other one is legalized lawlessness, and then is the question of hidden transcripts. And we'll come to those in good time. But I sort of want to start off with the question of slow violence. For us, we, building off of Rob Nixon's work, we understand it as like the accumulation, the kind of impulse it takes, things that take place over time, destruction and decay that takes place over time, that because it takes place over time, no one really is deemed responsible for it. There's a kind of tidy hands because it takes place sometimes far away or very slowly. It's normalized. The type of decay and destruction you see becomes accommodated. People see it as background to the stage of their lives. These things may sometimes be in plain sight, but they often aren't recognized, nor the consequences of this decay and destruction really quite visible in public discussion. And more importantly, these things aren't necessarily viewed as violence per se. They're sometimes attributed to just simply poor decision making or lack of funds. But the type of intentionality, the type of decision making that put this destructive force in motion isn't quite recognized. It's the same thing as we sort of well know with climate change, the climate crisis. There are lots of contributing factors. There are decisions behind all the contributing factors. There are interests behind all these factors and decisions, but very few of these are recognized. So this is the type of context that we're dealing with. At the same time, though, we draw inspiration from African techno-feminists. African techno-feminists have long sort of understood how people have been subordinated because of identity, because of their place, because of their situation, because of the type of attributes that they have, that these things are they are both rooted in a political economy, that patriarchy is systematic, and that people who are themselves subjugated and oppressed to these types of systems may themselves also have affiliations to them. We sort of see this on the African continent when it comes to AI, because people who there's a lot of aspirational neo-modernist language that technology will ultimately leapfrog these stagnant African societies and give them a kind of vitality. We sort of see language around the fourth industrial revolution, that Africa must now position itself to best maximize this type of opportunity. These types of languages are common amongst African politicians and their officials. There's, as I say, an aspirational element to it. There's a neo-modernization element to it. There's a kind of sequencing. There's a kind of path. There's a kind of, if we create good data subjects, then we will be able to reap the rewards of datafication, AI, the types of complexes that uses. This is seen as a mechanism to try bring wealth, create wealth, keep wealth within the African context. But again, a lot of this isn't really linked to the types of slow violence that data and computation more broadly have introduced. We sort of well know, and I don't really want to rehash this too much, that biased AI classifications shape who receives credit for work, how content moderation can lead, how AI content moderation can lead to the spread of hate speech and misogyny. These things are particularly acute in African places because of the lack of real local language content moderation, because it's not deemed sufficiently, it doesn't return to value, for example. We also know that there's a considerable amount of the devices that are sort of manufactured in the Philippines and in India and in China, or the minerals for that are dug up by artisanal miners, by child miners, in very difficult environments, in very oppressive conditions. There's a lot of discussion about even sort of slave minery sort of going on in certain parts of the African continent. We also sort of see the type of click work that Africans are doing, because for example, OpenAI, in trying to train the data model to be less racist, misogynistic, and so on, has outsourced this type of work to click workers in Kenya. So the African subject, the African person, has to see all the violence and has to be, has to take on that terror, has to be able to, is affected by that, so that people in the north are less exposed to it. So again, we also see these types of smartphone sweatshops in developing countries all across the world. These commonplace things, and they are very commonplace, this is part of the economy in which we live in, are often devastating, but they're typically not front page news. It's very rare that these types of things that I'm discussing make the front page of the New York Times. And if it is, it's an expose. In other words, did you know that? Rather than these are things that are common knowledge for people being subjugated by these larger global systems. Indeed, we kind of have a bit of a willful ignorance. Now, if we want to think a little bit about, you know, the type of white ignorance that we have about who benefits from systems and who signs onto them and who just happens to be a beneficiary and who's definitely not included in the social compact, we can sort of see that Africans don't tend to be the types of subjects who benefit from this type of complex. They very much are doing the work. They're doing a very horrific work, but they're not getting rewards for their work, nor are they conditions in which there are real options about, is this desirable work? The work that is available is undignified and it's designed to be undignified. At the same time, though, and Liz will speak a little bit more about this, these outcomes are not inevitable. I mean, as Lola Ufumululi speaks over here, that there's potentials, there's aspirations, there's emancipations that are viable, that these things do exist. But we need to think about these types of futures to bring them more into existence. You know, we can certainly sort of imagine them, but we need to do the work, as it were, to try and bring these things, to make them a little bit more realized, to realize them in the material sense over here. And so what we're trying to do is we want to think a little bit about using and being inspired by feminist resistance projects to think about slow violence, to think about legalized lawlessness, and to think about, you know, the hidden transcripts to sort of use Kate Crawford's term about, you know, the AI life cycle from birth to death, from the mining all the way to the data analysis. Like, are there moments and are there places, are there conjunctures, are there opportunities to actually make these futures realizable? And what kinds of things do we need to pay attention to? What kinds of hidden transcripts do we need to pay attention to maybe support, to help bring to help nurture, try and bring these things into existence? I've spoken a little bit about how, you know, we're trying to make data extractivism more visible. So I'm not going to sort of belabor the point, but we sort of know that extractivism is a type of accumulation of wealth through the extraction of resources in the African sense, you know, mirroring the colonial and the neo-colonial relationships. These resources aren't processed, refined, value added in the countries of extraction. These are taken to other places, to other types of factories that aren't sort of in the African space. Again, we sort of see the African subject as someone who's just positioned to do the dirty work, that's all that they're good for. And again, this type of geopolitical structure, this global political economy, this international political economy, these supply chains have this type of, in our respect, in our mind, have this kind of racist incantation to them, because, you know, if African subjects are only, you know, good for doing the dirty work, what other types of conclusions must be taken, must you know, come to mind? In this respect, the slow violence of AI has some features that are remarkably similar to the colonial experience, the colonial horror, the colonial genocides that have come before them. Now, they might not be in the same way. That's still yet to be determined, but these are things that prod our minds, that we are wanting to speak to think a little bit more about, not simply to write off at this stage as being unfathomable, because the slow violence that we sit within, that are normalized around us, may in fact go there without us sort of realizing it. With that, I'm going to turn to Liz, and Liz, you just tell me when you want the slides to move. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for that wonderful introduction to slow violence. I'm going to talk a bit about the slow violence still, and combine it with the narratives that have often combined it when it comes to major societal changes and major technological changes. So I'm going to start with globalization, and when African countries were just also getting independence and also getting to manage their own countries, there was globalization also happening at the same time, and there were calls for structural adjustments for them to open up their markets and benefit from globalization. So those are the narratives. But as we look at these narratives, they're often instructions to the global south without any consideration of what negative might come from this good. Combined with that is the optimism that technology often brings to the society, promises improvement of lives, promises reduction of equality, and all those nice things, which are true. And however, as it's been said that technology has actually improved life, more people are now starting to say that is it equally improving lives? So questions about, yes, there are those people who are living better than our grandfathers did, but how about those who are extremely disadvantaged? Are they living better than our grandfathers? And you are trying to look at these new inequalities from two angles. One, the hierarchy between the global north and the global south, and two, from the feminist perspective, trying to see how digital dividends are actually being shared. So the concept of slow violence, like Scott had mentioned, it's very slow, and because it's very slow, it's not easy to detect. And a good example of it is climate change, or where we have company emissions and deeply affecting people's health. So it can go as far as affecting more generations without even being noticed. So comparing to this with algorithms and the nature of AI is that one, it lacks transparency. There's so much opacity, and decisions are being made about human beings even without them knowing, so that it's so difficult to actually tell what is really impacting you, because it lacks that dramatic effect. And so when we have biased decisions for certain community, it means that the effects of those biased decisions may take very long to actually be realized. The other point is about extractivism, and feminists actually say that this is from a masculinity kind of view, where more resources are demanded with the narrative that is going to improve lives, creating better products for the society. But with the AI, again, we see that human beings are used as raw materials, data generators. But the narrative on the other end is that they're users of platforms. And so they're actually benefiting from platform, while that is not the case. So data is being taken from human beings. And on the other hand, they don't have the capacity, or they don't have the access to data to actually benefit from their own data as a community. So we also say that data governance is being regulated from an individual point of view, other than community point of view, which is something that I'll talk about later when you're talking about legalized lawlessness. That when someone is being targeted, they're not being targeted as an individual, they're being targeted as a community. But right now, the type of governance system that we have on data is more on data protection rather than community protection and governing data from a community interest. Next slide, please. So the next point I'm going to talk about is about automation and human cloud, the concept that you can put your work out there and seek skills and get services done. And on the other hand, people can actually get to platforms and get to see what work is out there and work on them while getting the benefits of them. So it's being argued again from a feminist perspective that with the gig economy and human cloud, being that females actually when taking care of the domestic functions, and this is in relation to unrecognized and unpaid labor, then they can actually switch from those domestic roles to actually work that can earn them money. But feminists argue that this is not really a solution to the problem of unpaid labor, because one, it only increases the amount of time that women have to work. And two, this kind of work does not come with benefits. There's no health protection, insurance, there's no things like pension and all that. And so what the society faces in future when people, a certain generation is out of the labor market, is that a significant part of the population will actually be deeply impoverished because they don't have these securities and they didn't have access to sort of employment that had this benefit. And another one is about surveillance, about replacing human beings and automating their work. So another question that we ask here is, who is benefiting from this? Who's actually gaining? Because we say, again, with automation, we are increasing efficacy of human production. And so more resources are created. But how is that resource being distributed again? And whose efficiency is it creating again? Of course, there are jobs lost. And the intention, the back intention of this is so as to create visibility, to see which human is working effectively, which is not, where there's redundancy, and track of those whose work have been considered redundant. So in the end, it actually serves the capitalists so that there's reduced costs, and at the same time, there's more visibility. But on the other hand, from the worker side, there's so much surveillance. Next slide, please. So at this point, we're also talking about governing inequalities. And this is something that, that comes out a lot with AI ethics and AI governance. So governing inequalities is about how communities are governed, again, to the first point that I was talking about, that people are not being surveilled as individuals, but as communities. That means that when someone is when someone is being targeted, they are targeted as part of a community when they're going to access public service or when they're going to public spaces. So there's increased policing. There's so much data extraction from underserved community because there's so much doubt whether they're acting as good citizens. So that's where the policing comes in. There's so much doubt as whether they really deserve the public services. So extra checks are being put in place for those members of those communities when they're accessing public services or even public spaces. And I'm just forgetting the next thing that I was about to say, but it's an example of how when statistics actually error in how in these processes of giving out values. So for example, an insurance system or education system and all that. So when there's human error or even computational error, it's usually one, it's difficult to actually notice what caused this error and why someone is being affected by it. So that's again slow violence. But number two is the cost of this for this error on a particular human being and in relation to the community where they belong. So for example, a simple computational error can take 1 year to actually determine what is causing it. And not only that, even just to solve it, in case someone misses an opportunity in a slot in education or any other restorative or distributive initiative by the government. Next slide, please. So here we are talking about justification of this kind of violence. And what, from the lens that you are building up on, is Caroline Elkin's work on legalized lawlessness. Her work is based on analyzing the British rule, decades of rule, how they carried out atrocities and how they justified for them by actually coming up with laws, backward laws, to justify their past action, or how they explained or used tools such as religion to actually justify whatever else that they did to a society. And this concept is about how these decades of rule, you see how it's marked, the places where it's marked. It's a very large part of the world, and how now it's affecting how the world is governed today. So most of the narratives, again, today in today's digital society, power rests with those who own infrastructure, those who have access to data. And those who have access to data actually process data according to the values that they see that make sense to them, rather than the society's value. And so we see, again, these patterns of violence and these patterns of hierarchy coming down to how people and their data are governed, also with respect to communities. Next slide, please.
So Liz, this is mine, so I'm going to jump in over here.
Okay.
So I am very cognizant, very well aware of the time, so I'm just going to tidy up a little bit. One of the things that we have sort of seen, as Liz has articulated over here, is that there are a number of narratives that circulate, in policy spaces, amongst policymakers, at the very high level meetings, the various types of conferences that take place very frequently across the world. But many of these types of narratives tend to be very self-serving. They tend to amplify, exaggerate, hype up the types of value that AI can bring, while often downplaying some of the harms that are coming about. Liz sort of spoke a little bit about the harms, and she spoke a little bit about the types of legalized lawlessness that we also sometimes see creep into regulatory regimes. What we mean by legalized lawlessness is the attempt to try do a post hoc justification of the harms to render prior illegal action legalized, to say that ultimately it was good. This is a type of colonial activity that was very, very frequent, and we can sort of explore that more in the Q&A if you wish. I want to finish off though with a little bit of a question around hidden transcripts, and this comes off of the good work of James Scott. The main point over here that we want to sort of encapsulate is, despite the types of conversations that take place at the high level panels that we sort of very, very well aware of, there's also a kind of discourse that sometimes is present in those places. Sometimes there's certainly African dignitaries and delegates that are there that listen, but also think differently. And so one of the things that we want to try and suggest is that despite the policy space, the global policy space, being rife with sort of a kind of hype around what AI will bring, what kinds of public goods it'll bring, what kinds of benefits it'll bring, at the same time, there's a lot of skepticism, particularly from the African perspective. While the leaders and dignitaries and officials from African countries may sometimes have to speak about the goods and the benefits, there's also a lot of disgruntledness that's there too. These are types of forms of resistance and dissent that sometimes don't make it into the official statements that are put out, but they still are nevertheless there. What I'm trying to sort of convey is simply because we don't quite sort of see active resistance or resistance that we can identify that is easily present to our eyes, that may have benefited from the types of white ignorance that has allowed the slow violence to carry on uninterrupted, doesn't mean that that type of resistance isn't there. What I'm trying to say is that we need to re-gauge the types of gaze that we bring to African spaces, so we might be able to sort of see what resistance is visible, and if we affiliate with that type of resistance, to try amplify it a little bit more. So we're going to end up with a bit of a question about the future. Who gets to shape the future? How can we try to sort of prevent slow violence being normalized in policy spaces, that it isn't a kind of generative logic that just simply accepts these types of outcomes or describes them as unpleasantries or unfortunate, but rather sort of sees them as as features of these harmful processes. We also want to think a little bit about, who's funding what. In a policy space, it's very difficult to have an outwardly antagonistic view on data governance to maybe suggest that the types of projects that have been set in a global north and may work for those places, as they are being rolled out and pushed upon, invited, or there are invitations for Africans to pick them up, to recognize that these types of programs might not be suitable for African situations. What we sort of mean over here is very sort of practical elements around, what the language of data localization, data sovereignty is trying to point to. We sort of know that it's very difficult at a technical level to insist upon data sovereignty. The internet simply cannot work if you have these types of hard stipulations. At the same time, though, the type of language that is being deployed by activists is trying to signal something about who gets to control, who gets to decide benefits from, where does yields accrue to, what is the byproduct of all of this process. And can this process even look and be slightly different? We think that this type of language or this type of rhetoric around data sovereignty, data localization is suggestive of these more deeper, more challenging types of questions. And so, again, we want to think a little bit about why this type of language is in policy space, but why it's simply confined to something that isn't quite technically possible. Why is it that African policy think tanks are advocating for something that isn't quite technically possible? And maybe if the funders looked slightly differently, the language would be different, the types of projects would be different, so on and so forth. So ultimately, I'm going to pause over there. I'm sure we have a number of sort of questions, and happy to deal with things a little bit more in depth in our upcoming conversation. Thank you. We have our email address at the bottom over here on our last slide. So if anyone wishes to get in touch with us, you can certainly do so through info@researchictafrica.net. Otherwise, our email address is also on our organization's website, and we're more than happy to correspond further with questions, disagreements, tangents, and all of the above. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott, for this talk, and Liz too. I think Liz, I don't see her anymore, but I hope she's fine. But anyway, thank you both for the presentation. And while others might have some questions, and if you can raise your hands so that we can hear them. Anyway, I have two questions, just like for a start. I think that the notion of slow violence is very interesting in that it kind of expands as you were saying, the notion of when you tackle only the notion of extractivism, it can be analyzed for example, in a Marxist framework, and it's just a time and a place, right? So it's like a process of how wealth is basically appropriated by as you in your slides, the capitalists. So it's like extractivism. It's an appropriation. It's a process of appropriation of wealth. When you are talking about slow violence, this point in time, this space and time is kind of seen through time, and I would say also through space, because this has different effects. Not only in the space of in the time and space of extraction, but also like in different moments and different places, because this has different consequences that you cannot foresee. The process is slow enough that you cannot see it at some point, and then you have to infer what is going on in a specific place, and then kind of like go back at the point T1 and see, okay, this is like following the pieces and going back to somewhere. I think this process opens up a space of research, which is incredible, I think, just to see how to put up the pieces and really track down what is the process like that is causing, or at least contributing to something that you see in the present. And because slow violence has been connected also to the climate change, I can imagine, for example, there have been some different events along history in which we can see this. I mean, the other day I was looking at a video in 1816. There was an explosion of a volcano in Indonesia, and the black clouds went to the northern part of the globe. And it was a year in which in Europe and North America, it was completely dark. So it was, I mean, there was an increase in poverty, an increase in famine, different things were going on. And if we think about those years, it was, there were a lot of things going on in Europe along the politics of Napoleon at that time, for example. So maybe these things, they also impact in a different way, this kind of political events in a different place. We can, I mean, just to bring it over to later events, we can think of that as the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, as something that happened in 2001, 2003. And then, of course, you have like 15 years later, a crisis, a so-called crisis of migrants into Europe. Like a lot of people coming from these destroyed communities or destroyed infrastructures and spaces, and then many of them needing to go back to another space like Europe. Or if we talk about colonial times, of course, there is a lot of connections, and that explains, like nowadays, that Rishi Sunak and Indy is like the Prime Minister of the UK, right? So this has like a lot of things going on in different points in places and times. So in a way, it's really exciting to see these possibilities. In another way, it's also challenging how to develop a methodology in which you can put all these together and track down the kind of the original point where this is happening, so that the slow violence effect is really like understood, or a little bit like like getting something out of it.
I think that those are very insightful remarks and comments. You know, there are different spaces and times and different impacts. So, you know, the mining takes place 6 years ago, it's put into a component, and then it goes to a data process, and then it, you know, so on and so forth. And then you and I are now running ChatGPT queries, right? So these things, as you say, there are these multiple dimensions, there are these different elements to it. It's also complicated because you're dealing with different types of sectors too, right? They all start, you know, being constitutive elements of this larger process. They are part of the delta, as it were, of, you know, and tributaries of this mechanism of this process of slow violence. Different types of expressions, different types of moments, different types of sectors, different places and times, so on and so forth. And again, all bound by this process of appropriation, you know, through cuts with commodity chains, through cut with labor processes, through cuts with exploitation of all kinds. I think the one thing that's very challenging, maybe even more so for policy researchers than, say, the social scientist or the philosopher, and this is the type of thing that Liz and I are dealing with on a day-to-day basis when we talk to our peer organizations, is that policy research tends to be very bounded, right? Like, here, let's talk about this policy in this place at this time, and what can you recommend? Like, it's very recommendation based. It's very discrete. Like, it's excessively analytical, and it's also not political. So there's certain things that simply cannot be said. And within those types of constrained parameters, one has to offer advice, and most of your sensible advice is always pushed aside, of course. And so these are the types of constraints that policy research is also working with. At the same time, though, we see that there's a lot of value, to think like the social scientists, to say, well, let's think about the totality of the slow violence around AI from this type of perspective. So what is this? What kind of stance can we take to this totality, and how can we create an analysis that's a little bit more synthetic, that can provide recommendations that are a little bit more thicker than simply this bound thing. One of the tensions that and Liz, I'll maybe get you to opt in over here too, is is as much as there's the types of hidden transcripts that take place with colonial subjects, the neo-colonial policymaker or policy analyst, policy researcher in a global South and majority world is wrestling with very similar kinds of considerations. What can and cannot be said at what time, the suitability. And you have all the elements about like rhetoric and kairos, and do these things matter or do they not matter? And are things actually going to be listened to by power? So again, I think for myself, we need to go beyond these sort of very discrete, bounded, analytically sensitive types of approaches to do the grand, to think a bit more broadly, to really take up the challenges that concepts like slow violence force us to try reconcile with. I'm going to pass over to Liz.
Yeah, I'm gonna just contribute to that about the rhetorics around policy circles and how it affects the global South from advocating for their own policies. Because most of the time we see policies being transferred from the global North to the global South, but they lack specific context for support. So for example, institutions are shaped differently and are governed differently, so that the same policies do not actually work in this other context. Sometimes even priorities, what the immediate needs and priorities in the global South are not considered, because there are some other wider fights in the global order that where narratives are being formed, and the global South has to get into that. The other one is funding, and most of it actually of absorption of these narratives and policies, the main element of them is funding, because there's so much dependency within the hierarchies, global South and North, on not just resources, but right now on data intelligence. And it's going to be a type of colonialism that is going to even be worse, not just me saying, but other scholars also saying too, that relying on other people on digital intelligence is going to have far more reaching consequences than even what colonialism did. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for your answers. I don't know if somebody wants to jump in at this point and ask a question. Yes, Mikhail, he wants to ask you a question.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope the microphone is working well and you can hear me. Great. Thank you for raising the topic that is really making us think, and that makes us understand that the topics of global capitalism and artificial intelligence, the role of artificial intelligence is way more complex than we can just initially expect. My question is about probably the opportunity, or maybe even more, even a threat, a different type of threat. I don't know, but my question is about open sourcing the artificial intelligence. Well, we know that open source is a kind of way to avoid the domination of big corporations. In many ways, it democratizes the tools, and specifically for artificial intelligence, it's one more way to distribute this technology. My question is whether do you think that it can be kind of either help or vice versa, threat to the topic of fighting the slow violence. And does this kind of approach, when we limit corporations and give more opportunities to use the tools and to advance artificial intelligence, not in the way the governments want to, but in a slightly different manner, can it help? Can it make any change? What do you think about that?
I mean, my first thing, Mikhail, is that's an excellent question. There are a couple of considerations that come to my mind. The first thing around open sourcing AI, whatever the specific type of AI happens to be, whether it be automated driving vehicles, whether it be mapping, whether it be agricultural drones or generative language models, for the most part, I endorse that because it allows people to do some sort of audits of these systems. And I think the more that we can audit these, the better, the more confidence we can have in understanding what they're actually doing. And then we are better placed to make decisions about, the value, the virtue, the worthiness, so on and so forth. I mean, if BMW and Mercedes-Benz's engines look different, but we understand how an engine works, right? And so, I think that there's some value in using open source models to try increase the literacy, the technical literacy, so that we have a better appraisal of what's actually going to happen, because otherwise you're stuck around the hype. At the same time, one of the things that I'm a little bit wary of it is how open source has been used in the past. I did my master's on open source technology way back when. I'm going to age myself when I start to talk about this. As you can see, the hair is going, right? And one of the things that was very interesting to me is that Microsoft at the time was the biggest user of open source technology. And one of this was in some way to reduce production costs. Also, sort of shared systems allows more types of interoperability, allows people to use the base system, and then Microsoft products are designed specifically to fit into it. And so there's an attempt to sort of create a kind of vendor lock-in. Not quite vendor lock-in, but it kind of creates the opportunities for vendor lock-in. And so there's that type of difficulty too. I don't think that's insurmountable. That's a practical, not a theoretical. There's a final consideration to me, which is a little bit more political, and that's when if we start to create open source systems over here, and there starts to be lots of community production and contributions to that. What's to stop it from being subsequently enclosed off? And again, we have all of this labor that's being donated to the project, subsidizing it, and now it's just again rendered to the private sphere of life. Again, that's also a practical question. That's also a political question to ensure that you have the right types of property regulations in place so that this type of development doesn't simply just get taken over by capitalists looking to develop AI on the cheap. So those are my intuitions. I'm going to hand over to Liz.
Thank you.
Sorry, can you hear me? Thanks. So my contribution would be that data needs to be regulated from a pluralistic point of or angle, taking into consideration various groups and what their interests are. And that means that when regulating data, we have to consider who we are giving power to, because access to data gives a particular player more power to reorganize the society, the economy, and the politics of it. So even the regulation itself has to start with the idea or the aim of actually ensuring that this power doesn't rest within a few individuals. And also that means even within the countries, that it doesn't also rest within one sector again, because you give power to one sector, maybe government or private sector, there are going to be atrocities. So there has to be that check and balance when it comes to regulation of data. And I think open source is coming up as a solution right now for this type of regulation with plural interest. But we don't have to stop there because again we have to ask, yes, we make this data open, but who are we giving power to? Because people have different types of people have different capacities for taking advantage and analyzing this data and getting intelligence from it.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Scott. I don't know if there is another question from the participants. Well, otherwise, I have another question, and maybe it gives them time if they want to ask something else. I'm also like, you're interested in I mean, your program, you're saying that you're interested in the hidden transcripts. And I'm also like asking myself, and there are sociologists among us, that probably how do you go, like how do you plan to go deeper into that? Because I think that would need probably a more focused approach or something like zooming in to specific practices. I say this also because you are talking about slow violence in AI in Africa in general. This is, I mean, interesting also because when I see people from the north talking about Africa, many times they sadly refer to Africa mostly as if it was a country. Yes, in the rhetorics of being just a single territory or an homogeneous territory. And of course, what I mean, you showed some pictures from maybe Congo, which is completely different than Namibia, just in the amount of like the density, the population density, or Mali, or you know, Kenya, or something. Different places, they have their own kind of their own systems. So how do you plan, or how would you focus on this approach on hidden transcripts? As at this point, you still have like the big word Africa. So, but how would you like organize like research around these hidden transcripts, for example, the places of resistance?
Liz, would you like to go first?
Interesting question. And our research, in our research and approach in Africa, we advocate that we don't approach Africa with a one solution to everything, because Africa is a continent with diverse contexts, different levels of economic, social, political development. So one approach would not really fit into it. On the matter of hidden transcript, because again, hidden transcript is a tool for dissent, and how it actually comes about is when people don't have a say in whatever solutions are being developed for them, and they are forced to take some particular action. And that is what also Scott was talking about solutions towards Africa to solve whatever needs that the continent has. Usually comes with narratives from the global south, and mostly it has to be accepted at the global south, because again, to get more benefits because of those resource dependencies and all that, then they have to comply. I don't know how from policy research how that's going to balance, but I think the challenge here is create more narratives, or narratives based on research for their policy industry to actually start working on.
I'm going to pick up where Liz left off, and for me, I think one of the questions to get to the real texture of the hidden transcripts, to get to those transcripts themselves, I think is to start with the question of who benefits. And go speak to those, empirically go speak to those people. If for example, if Safaricom, which is a big telecommunication network in Kenya, says that its mobile money credit service is of tremendous benefits because it's been able to do your A, B, and C, it's been able to become a type of currency, it's been able to create loans for people to gain access to short-term funds, if these are things that are said to be for the benefit of people, let's go talk. Let's ask them: do they find these things beneficial, and what are the things that may in fact be put into motion because of these types of affordances? For example, to return us to Safaricom, its mobile money system that it has allows you to do very high interest short-term loans that sort of create sort of a debt cycle. And so the thing that's supposed to be beneficial ultimately creates a debt treadmill that traps many people in a system where they cannot get credit outside of this micro platform based credit system, ultimately constraining choice rather than, to take it at face value, the platform saying, oh, we're offering you choice for how to create livelihoods and the like. So I think that starting with that type of question, who benefits, and seeing whether those benefits actually materialize, and how do people experience these types of affordances, and what do they have to say about them? Because when you go to Kenya, you speak to people, the only people that have anything good to say about Safaricom are its executives. So there are hidden transcripts there. It's just that those transcripts aren't on the stage at the World Economic Forum. Thank you.
Thank you for your answers, Scott and Liz. And I don't know, somebody else from the audience? Okay, maybe if not, I'm gonna probably ask another question. I'm probably just thinking in wrapping it up. Yes, like in this idea of legalized lawlessness, I think that's also very, very important in the points that you're bringing up. How does it connect with this slow violence? Because I think it's like legalized lawlessness, it sounds like a kind of a structural thing. So in many ways, it can be associated with a structural violence and something that is already there, like producing its own effects all the time. Like in that sense, it's not, it's like, yeah, permanent. So how do you connect that with a notion of slow violence that goes over time? Just interested in just how to see these two dimensions, how they produce like their own dynamic. Is more or less on that side.
Liz, if you could go.
I was hoping that you would go first, maybe borrow some ideas from you, but let me take it. Connecting the two, especially from Caroline Elking's work when she analyzed how the British Empire committed the atrocities and the things that they used to justify it with. One is religion. So when you're slapped on one side, give the other cheek and all that. The other one was hiding evidence of these atrocities so that they don't come to the fore and reported in Britain. So they stayed in the colonies. And another one was coming up with laws, changing the laws so that whatever atrocities that were committed, they can't be justifiable. And so that means that the people who are affected don't, I can't say that there's no dramatic effect to connect it to slow violence, but some of those justifications, such as religion, people end up accepting what is being done to them. And on the other side, they are grateful for the narratives, effects of colonialism and whatever benefits that it comes to them. It becomes then slow to recognize that atrocities are being done to certain communities. And then that kind of role divide and conquer, where still narratives are pushed down to people with the same group of people, so that people realize that it's actually not wrong what was done to them, because people of similar identities are actually taking up these other narratives that is being peddled by people in authority. So in some ways, some of these tools, how they are applied, they can actually amount to some sort of slow violence, because the nature of it not being realized by those who are governed. And at the same time, you're right to connect it with hidden transcript as well, because also hidden transcript doesn't just happen like the powerful narratives being pushed down to people. It also happens down, as Scott also had said, that those who are governed or those with lesser powers, they also have their own narratives, and in solidarity using that as tool for resistance. And this process can be slow, and that's why you might not see resistance erupting very fast. It's a slow process where resistance builds over time, and by the time you see it erupting to the top, and hidden transcript becoming actually public transcript, it might take time.
For myself, the connection between slow violence and legalized lawlessness comes to the rendering a process an event, to circumscribe it and say that here was an error, it was an anomaly. The routine is made an anomaly, it's made the exception. And so we'll put a tight boundary on this and say, okay, so there was an injustice done over here. The data breach that happened at this bank, it is a once-off. It's not a question of like, we have inadequate regulations and poor data controllers because there were bribes that were distributed to ensure that these data laws, data regulations are weak, so that the entire corporate sector could benefit from being able to, breach privacy rights, so on and so forth. It's the attempt to render, to somewhat neutralize, I would say, the relational, the historical. It's the attempt to simply tidy up, to give the power of law and to use law to simply suggest that that's an anomaly, and now we've fixed it, we've patched that hole. We no longer have to think about it in these relational, historical processes. These things are, it's the attempt, I think, to simply to neuter the relational. I mean, I'm happy to have other people jump in on that, but that's really where I think my thinking is located at the moment. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Scott and Liz, again. And if we don't have any other questions, I think we can leave it here. But it would be great if you, I mean, you seem to be producing an article out of this. If you can send it over to the community here in the fellows by the time you publish it or something, it would be incredible to have it with us. Like maybe we can really look into it and how you develop these ideas further into the text, and yeah, to be able to share that.
Well, thank you. I've dropped the link into the text to an essay that we've written for Tech Policy Press. At the moment, we're still trying to, one of the things about sort of being a policy researcher is that you have a boss who gives you deadlines, right? And so the scope for writing a scholarly articles, let's just say that there's a kind of legalized lawlessness around that has to tidy things up and keep them constrained. But thank you, Javier, for inviting us today, and we really appreciate taking the opportunity to share our thoughts with you. And again, you have our email addresses. So if anyone wishes to reach out, if you wish to, upon second thought, think that we've said nothing of value and you want to tell us it, welcome to do that too. So we'll take any feedback, good or bad or otherwise.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Tina, and the University of Rijeka and the CAS program for having us. And I hope you enjoyed. I really enjoyed talking to you guys. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Thank you for your contacts. And yeah, lots of luck with the research.
Thank you. Thank you. See you next week on our seminar on Thursday also. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.